Welcome to Daily Sci-Fi Stories. Join us for the best in original sci-fi. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
The vast expanse of the lunar landscape, a silent, unforgiving canvas of gray dust and jagged rock, was all Elias knew. For 10 years, he had been a fixture in this desolation, a solitary shepherd of genetically engineered moon-horn cattle. His ranch, nothing more than a few interconnected geodesic domes and a sprawling network of climate-controlled pastures, was a defiant pinprick of green and life against the eternal monochrome. The nearest settlement, a bustling hub known as the Crater, was a 200-mile hoversled ride away, a journey he undertook only when absolutely necessary for supplies. He had chosen this life, the quiet, the space, the profound, uninterrupted isolation. It was a kind of therapy for a man who had seen too much of humanity in a galaxy that was too small for its ambitions. The rhythm of his days was a simple, comforting loop, checking the atmospheric regulators, mending a section of fencing, monitoring the health of his herd, and in the evening, sitting on his porch, a thermal mug of synth brew in his hands, watching the bloated, majestic sphere of Earth hang in the black sky, a distant, impossible jewel. His only companions were the chuffing of the cattle and the mechanical hum of the ranch's automated systems. They were predictable, reliable, and blessedly silent in their own way. That silence was shattered one night. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavier than sound, and it was broken by a high-pitched, insistent electronic wail that sliced through the night's calm. It was the perimeter alarm. Elias, whose sleep was as light as the moon's gravity, was out of his bunk and at the main console in seconds, his hand already on the grip of the plasma rifle he kept mounted on the wall. His heart pounded in a slow, heavy rhythm he hadn't felt in years. The last time the perimeter alarm had gone off, it had been a pack of feral lunar foxes, and he had spent a frustrating hour herding them away from the herd. This was different. The alarm's tone was specific. It was a humanoid alert. A trespasser. He brought the external cameras online, a flicker of static giving way to a crisp, high-definition image of the main gate. The harsh floodlights he had installed years ago to deter predators bathed the area in an artificial glare, and in the center of the glare, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was small, a mere dot against the imposing metal of the gate, no taller than 4 feet. A child? On this moon? The idea was impossible. He knew every person in a 500-mile radius, and none of them had children. The thought of a lost child in this desolation filled him with a cold dread that was 1,000 times worse than the fear of any predator. He checked the life sign scanner, a tool he usually used to monitor the herd. The readout was clear: one biological entity, humanoid, small, but with a complex series of energy signatures that were utterly alien. It was not a child. Elias lowered the rifle, a sense of weary curiosity replacing his alarm. He toggled the intercom. "This is the rancher. Identify yourself." The voice that came back was a surprise. It was soft, melodic, with a strange, lilting cadence, but it was not a child's voice. "I am Alexia. My vessel experienced catastrophic failure and was forced to land. I require assistance." Her voice was laced with exhaustion, so profound it was almost a physical thing. It was a voice that had not slept in a very long time. "You're alone?" asked Elias, his gaze fixed on the small figure. "I am." "How did you get here? Where's your ship?" He was already moving toward the airlock, slipping on his insulated jacket and gloves. He didn't wait for an answer. He needed to see this for himself. The fact that she was here at all was a miracle, and it spoke of a desperate situation. As he reached the gate, he saw her in full. She was wearing a patchwork garment of iridescent fibers and durable synthetics, a utilitarian travel suit that had seen better days, and her head was covered by a tight-fitting hood. The only part of her that was exposed were her eyes, which were a striking liquid silver that reflected the harsh light. She looked like a child, and yet her posture, the way she held herself, was that of an adult burdened with a weight that was too heavy for her small frame. Her hands, which she held together, were delicate and graceful, with 3 long, slender fingers on each. As he stood before her, the automated gate hissed open, and she took a step inside, her gaze fixed on him with a mixture of hope and caution. "You are not hostile?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "No, I'm just a rancher. You said your ship had a forced landing?" He still couldn't get over how small she was. It seemed so out of place in this harsh, grand landscape. "It was 10 miles from here," she said, her silver eyes looking past him toward the faint line of the horizon. He was right. She wasn't a child. She was a woman, and her diminutive stature was a characteristic of her people. He felt a small pang of foolishness. He had been so quick to assume. He led her inside, the heavy airlock door hissing shut behind them, cutting off the moon's eternal silence. As they walked toward the living quarters, he offered her some synth brew and food, which she accepted with a quiet grace. She sat on the edge of a chair, her small form looking lost in the large utilitarian room. She explained, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, that her ship had been damaged by a meteor storm, but that she had managed to pilot it to a relatively soft landing. She had used a low-powered distress beacon, which had alerted his systems, and had made the long walk to the ranch, her journey taking over a day. He noticed a slight limp, a sign of her exhaustion. He offered her a place to rest, a spare bunk in the main dome. She was hesitant, but the sheer fatigue in her eyes won out. "Thank you," she said. Then she was gone, curled up in the bunk, asleep before he had even turned away. He sat back at his console, the plasma rifle feeling heavy and unnecessary in his lap. The life sign scanner showed her in a deep, peaceful sleep. He pulled up the orbital charts. A meteor storm was not unheard of, but one of that intensity was rare, especially in this sector. He checked the deep space logs. Nothing. No alerts, no warnings. The silence of the void had been a lie. He felt a prickle of unease. A lie or a deliberate omission? What if the storm wasn't natural? He pushed the thought away. It was late. He was tired. He had a ranch to run. And now he had a guest. He would deal with it in the morning. The next day, Elias woke to the smell of fresh synth brew. Alexia was at the console, her silver eyes focused on the star charts he had pulled up. She turned as he entered, her posture still that of an exhausted traveler, but with a new energy. "Your systems are remarkable. The data processing speed is extraordinary for a system of this age." Elias grunted. "It's old, but it works. I built most of it myself." "You look better." "I feel better. Thank you, Elias." She used his name, and the sound of it, spoken in her melodic voice, was a strange, pleasant surprise. "I should see my ship. It is not far. Perhaps you can take me in your hover sled." He agreed without hesitation. The idea of seeing a crashed alien vessel was too intriguing to pass up. He didn't know why, but he felt a pull to this situation. It reminded him of his old life, a life where things broke and he was the one who fixed them. He had long ago buried that part of himself, but it was stirring now, a dormant subroutine coming back to life. He prepared the hover sled, a rugged, all-terrain vehicle he had built for traversing the lunar terrain. It was a utilitarian machine, but it was powerful and reliable. They set off across the gray expanse, the only sound the low hum of the engine and the soft clatter of gravel against the reinforced chassis. As they got closer to the crash site, the desolate landscape became marred with a long, shallow trench, a scar on the moon's face. It was a straight line, a testament to the sheer force of the impact. The ship was at the end of the trench, half buried in the dust, its sleek, polished hull scorched and dented.
It was small, no bigger than a large shuttle, but its design was something Elias had never seen before. It was all graceful curves and organic lines, as if it had been grown rather than built. He felt a profound sense of awe, a feeling that had been missing from his life for too long. He had spent his life fixing human machines, which were all angles and logic, but this was something else entirely. It was art. It was biology. It was a puzzle he felt an irresistible urge to solve. Alexia stood beside him, her gaze fixed on her ship. "It is worse than I thought," she said, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "The primary energy conduit is ruptured. The gravitic stabilizers are offline. And the structural integrity, it is compromised." Elias walked around the ship, his eyes taking in every detail. He ran a hand over the scorched hull, the metal cool to the touch. It was a complex alloy, something he had never seen before, and it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He looked at the ruptured energy conduit. It was a mess of tangled wires and sparking terminals. He shook his head. "I'm a rancher, not an engineer, but I think I can get this to my ranch. It's too big to fix here. The stabilizers are the key. If I can get them working even partially, we can get it back to the domes." He ran a scanner over the damage, the screen of his handheld device flickering with a complex series of symbols he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He spent the next few hours working, his hands moving with an instinctual, practiced grace that had nothing to do with the alien technology and everything to do with a lifetime of fixing things. He used his plasma welder to seal the ruptured conduit, not understanding the flow of energy, but simply knowing that a closed circuit was better than an open one. He jerry-rigged a connection to a spare power cell he had in the sled, providing just enough juice to get a flicker of life into the ship's systems. Then he turned his attention to the gravitic stabilizers. He worked on them for what felt like an eternity, his mind humming with a quiet intensity. He was no longer just a rancher on a distant moon. He was a mechanic again, and he was working on the most beautiful, impossible machine he had ever seen. He finally stood back, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow. The ship's gravitic stabilizers hummed to life, a low, steady sound that vibrated through the air, but the hum was not quite right. It was a little too high, a little too loud, but it was working. He felt a surge of pride, a feeling he had forgotten. He looked at Alexia, and a slow smile spread across his face. "It's not perfect, but it's enough to get it back to the ranch." She looked at him, her silver eyes wide with astonishment. "How did you—" she began, her voice a mix of disbelief and awe. "I just fixed it. I've been fixing things my whole life. The ship's systems are a mystery to me, but the universal language of a broken machine is something I understand. A broken circuit is a broken circuit, no matter what it's made of." She looked at the ship, at the low, humming form of her vessel, and then she looked at him, and she could see in her eyes a new emotion: respect. She had found a true partner in a world that she thought was devoid of life. The next few hours were a delicate dance of piloting the hover sled and guiding the ship. The two vehicles moving in a slow, careful procession across the scarred landscape. The ship, with its partially working gravitic stabilizers, floated just inches above the ground, its wake of dust a ghostly, shimmering cloud behind it. When they finally reached the ranch, a sense of relief washed over them both. Elias guided the ship into the largest of his maintenance domes, the bay doors closing with a heavy thud, sealing them off from the moon's surface. Now came the hard part. The real work was about to begin. Elias looked at the ship, a monument to a technology he couldn't possibly understand, and yet he knew, in his bones, that he could fix it. He turned to Alexia and said, "I'm going to need your help. You're the one who understands how it works. I just know how to fix what's broken." She nodded. A small, grateful smile graced her lips. "Agreed. I do not fully understand your methods, but they are clearly effective." She gestured toward the damaged section. "The primary relay conduit is what failed. It's the central nervous system of the ship, controlling everything from navigation to life support. The power surge from the meteor impact, it was too much." Elias crouched down, running a diagnostic tool over the scorched cables. The screen was a whirlwind of indecipherable data, but the feeling was what mattered. The cable was dead. He'd need to replace it, or at least bypass it. He looked up at Alexia. "I don't have this part. I'll have to improvise." He stood, looking around his workshop, his eyes scanning the shelves of spare parts, the discarded electronics, the junk he had accumulated over a decade of living alone. He found a spool of heavy-duty fiber optic cable from an old comms array and a few spare power converters. He didn't know if they would work, but they were the best he had. He spent the next several hours meticulously weaving the fiber optic cable into a new conduit, bypassing the damaged sections of the old one. Alexia watched him, her expression a mixture of fascination and disbelief. "Your methods, they are so simple, yet so effective. We would have run complex diagnosis for days before we even attempted a repair." Elias laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. "When you're alone in the middle of nowhere, you learn to trust your gut. Fancy diagnostics don't fix a problem. They just tell you what the problem is. The real work is in the doing." She nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I am beginning to understand. Your people, you are not just a species of creators, you are also a species of menders." After another hour of careful work, he stood back, his face streaked with grease, his hands stained with the dust of the moon. He had managed to create a bypass, a new nervous system for the ship. He turned to Alexia. "Ready?" She gave him a small, nervous nod. He engaged the new conduit, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then a low hum filled the bay, growing in pitch until it was a steady, powerful thrum. The ship, which had been a dead hulk just hours before, was alive again. The lights on its hull flickered to life, a soft, ethereal blue that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Alexia let out a soft gasp of joy, her silver eyes shining in the dim light. She ran a hand over the hull, as if she were greeting a long-lost friend. "It is magnificent, Elias. You have done the impossible." He smiled, a genuine, joyful expression he hadn't worn in years. "I told you, I've been fixing things my whole life." He looked at the ship, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. This was more than just a job, it was an act of creation. He had taken something that was broken and made it whole again, not with a pre-programmed tool or a schematic, but with his own hands, his own knowledge, and his own raw determination. And as he looked at the humming, living ship, he knew, with an absolute certainty, that this was just the beginning. There was a mystery here, something more than a simple meteor storm. He had a feeling that the true story of this ship had just begun to unfold, and he was a part of it. He looked at the alien woman, her face filled with awe and gratitude, and he knew that his solitude was over. He had a new companion and a new purpose. The long, silent days were gone, replaced with the promise of adventure and discovery. He looked at the ship's internal systems, a chaotic mess of glowing conduits and pulsating cables, and thought, "This is a lot like my emotional state after a month of synth brew and no one to talk to." The low hum of the ship's restored systems filled the cavernous maintenance dome, a sound that was both alien and strangely comforting. Elias and Alexia stood before the vessel, the blue lights pulsating gently, a testament to Elias's ingenuity. He had bypassed the primary relay, creating a rudimentary but functional connection. The ship was alive, but it was far from whole. The primary relay was more than a power conduit. It was the ship's central nervous system, its communication hub, its brain. Without a fully functional relay, the ship was a beautiful inert sculpture. It couldn't fly, it couldn't navigate, and most importantly, it couldn't send a distress signal. Elias knew this was only the first step. The next phase of his work was not about fixing what was obviously broken, but understanding the intricate organic logic of the alien machine. Alexia, a small but resolute figure, had moved to the ship's entry hatch. The hatch, which had been scorched and fused shut, now hissed open with a soft sigh of hydraulics. The air inside the ship, once stale and dead, was now being slowly filtered and recycled by the newly reactivated life support systems. She disappeared inside, and Elias waited, a sense of patient anticipation. He was a man who understood patience. He had spent years waiting for crops to grow, for storms to pass, for the long, lonely days to turn into silent, star-dusted nights. This was a different kind of waiting. It was a shared experience, a quiet collaboration. Alexia emerged a few minutes later, her arms filled with a series of small, shimmering devices. They were sleek, elegant, and had no visible buttons or controls. "These are diagnostic tools," she explained, her voice a soft melody in the quiet dome. "They will interface with your systems and provide a more comprehensive understanding of the damage." She placed one of the devices on the console of Elias's main computer. The device pulsed, and a moment later, a cascade of alien symbols flowed across his screen. The symbols were beautiful, almost like a form of flowing calligraphy, but to Elias they were meaningless. Can you translate this?" he asked, a hint of frustration in his voice.
Alexia touched the screen, and the symbols shifted, reforming into a series of schematics and diagrams. They were still complex, but now they were a language he could understand. He saw the primary relay, its circuits a tangled, ruptured mess. He saw the gravitic stabilizers, their power output still dangerously low. He saw 1,000 other systems, all marked with red or yellow warnings. "The primary relay is the key," she said. "Everything else is connected to it. If we can't fix it, we can't go anywhere." She touched the screen again, and a holographic schematic of the ship appeared in the air above the console. The relay was at the heart of the ship, a pulsating nexus of power and information. It was like a biological heart, but made of wires and circuits and something he couldn't name. Elias studied the schematic, his mind working in a way it hadn't in years. It was a complex puzzle, a three-dimensional jigsaw. "The bypass I created, it's only temporary," he mused, a low murmur in the quiet dome. "It's like a Band-Aid on a massive wound. It's not a permanent fix." He ran a hand over the hologram. "We need to replace the core. Do you have a spare?" Alexia shook her head, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "No, they are unique. Each one is grown for a specific vessel. It is a part of the ship's life force." The word "grown" echoed in Elias's mind. A biological computer, an organic machine? It was a concept that was so alien, so profound that it almost defied belief. He had been fixing machines his whole life, but he had never fixed one that was alive. "Then we have to grow a new one," Elias said, the words coming out before he had even fully considered the implications. Alexia stared at him, her silver eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Grow? We do not simply grow new components. It is a long, meticulous process that requires a highly specialized laboratory and the proper genetic material." Elias looked at the holographic relay, at the pulsating, glowing heart of the ship. "Well, we have the genetic material, don't we? The old one is right there. It's broken, but it's still here. And as for the lab,
I have a hydro bay for the crops. It's not a lab, but it's a controlled environment. We can work with what we have." Alexia was quiet for a long moment, her small brow furrowed in concentration. She had seen how he worked. She had witnessed his intuitive, almost mystical ability to fix things he didn't understand. She had come to a realization. His methods were unconventional, but they were not illogical. They were born of necessity and a lifetime of self-reliance. She had come to understand that his understanding of the universe was not based on theory and data, but on practical experience and a deep, innate connection to the world of broken things. "It is unconventional," she said, her voice filled with a newfound respect. "But it is not impossible. I will need access to my ship's data logs, the schematics for the primary relay's genetic structure. I need to know how it was grown." And so the work began. They were a strange pair, the tall, weathered human rancher and the small, silver-eyed alien woman hunched over a console, one trying to understand the incomprehensible, the other trying to explain the unexplainable. Elias worked on the ship's physical systems, repairing and reinforcing the structure, while Alexia delved into the ship's data logs, a torrent of information that would have overwhelmed a less advanced mind. She spent hours in a state of quiet concentration, her fingers dancing over the holographic interface, her eyes a cascade of silver light. She was in her element, but she was in a world that was completely alien to her. She was a scholar, a scientist, a traveler. She was not a rancher, and she had never been a part of a project so rudimentary, so human. Elias, on the other hand, was in his element. He was surrounded by 1,000 problems, and he had 1,000 ways to solve them. He was a master of improvisation. He took the ship's damaged hull, a complex composite of alien alloys, and patched it with a heavy-duty sealant he had developed for his domes. He took the ship's subsystems, their delicate circuits frayed and broken, and he mended them with a precision born of a lifetime of working with his hands. He was a surgeon of the mundane, and he was working on a masterpiece of alien design. As they worked, a quiet friendship began to form. Alexia would emerge from the ship's data core, her mind reeling from the sheer volume of information, and Elias would be there, a fresh cup of synth brew in his hands, a silent invitation to rest. He would talk about his life, about the solitude of the moon, about the peculiar habits of his cattle. He would tell her stories of his past, of a time when he had been a starship engineer, a life that he had left behind in a blaze of disillusionment. He had been a part of a team, and he had learned that sometimes the biggest problems were not the broken machines, but the broken people who operated them. He had come here to escape, and in a strange twist of fate, he had found himself with a new mission, a new problem to solve, a new person to help.
Alexia, in turn, would tell him about her world, about the quiet beauty of her home planet, about the complexities of her society. She was a diplomat, a representative of her people, and her mission was to establish a trade agreement with the human colonies in the Neo sector. Her ship, the luminescent Whisper, was not just a transport, it was a vessel of diplomacy, a symbol of hope. The fact that it had been targeted, that it had been deliberately crippled, was a devastating blow not just to her, but to her people. "My people, we are not a warlike species," she explained one evening, her voice a fragile whisper in the quiet dome. "We value peace, knowledge, and harmony. But there are others who see our peaceful nature as a weakness. They wanted to stop me. They wanted to prevent the treaty from being signed." Elias listened, his expression a mixture of understanding and quiet fury. He had seen this before. He had seen the way that power-hungry factions would sabotage a peaceful mission for their own gain. It was a story as old as the stars. It was one of the reasons he had left. He had seen the ugly underbelly of humanity, and he had wanted nothing to do with it. But now he was faced with a new problem. This was not a human problem, this was a galactic one. And he was, for the first time in years, a part of something bigger than himself. Alexia finally found the schematics. They were buried deep in the ship's core, encrypted with a complex series of codes. She spent an entire night deciphering them, her small form curled up at the console, her mind a humming, tireless machine. When she finally emerged, her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, but there was a spark of triumph in them. "I have it," she said, her hoarse voice a whisper in the quiet dome. "The genetic sequence for the primary relay. It is more complex than I could have imagined. It requires a specific cocktail of rare elements, a precise temperature and atmospheric pressure, and a constant supply of a bioluminescent fluid that is not native to this moon." Elias listened, his face a mask of concentration. He didn't understand the science, but he understood the problem. He had to find a way to create a miniature ecosystem, a perfect, controlled environment for the relay to grow. He looked at his hydrobay, a simple utilitarian room filled with his crops. It was not a lab, but it was all he had. "The hydrobay is my best bet. I can control the temperature and the pressure. The rare elements, I have a few on hand. I've been scavenging from old ships for years. The bioluminescent fluid, that's the problem." Alexia nodded, her expression grim. "It is a fluid created by a specific species of bioluminescent flora on my home world. It is a vital nutrient for the relay's growth. Without it, it will not come to life." Elias listened, his face a mask of concentration. He didn't understand the science, but he understood the problem. He had to find a way to create a miniature ecosystem, a perfect, controlled environment for the relay to grow. He looked at his hydrobay, a simple utilitarian room filled with his crops. It was not a lab, but it was all he had. "The hydrobay is my best bet. I can control the temperature and the pressure. The rare elements, I have a few on hand. I've been scavenging from old ships for years. The bioluminescent fluid, that's the problem." Alexia nodded, her expression grim. "It is a fluid created by a specific species of bioluminescent flora on my home world. It is a vital nutrient for the relay's growth. Without it, it will not come to life." Elias looked at the screen, at the complex schematics of the relay, at the list of impossible requirements. He had spent his life solving problems, but this one felt impossible. And then he looked at Alexia, at her small, exhausted frame, at the glimmer of hope in her silver eyes. He couldn't give up. Not now.
He spent the next few days scouring his ranch, looking for a solution. He checked every nook and cranny, every piece of salvaged junk, every forgotten tool. He came up with nothing. He was at a dead end. And then he remembered. Years ago, a small cargo ship had crash-landed a few miles from his ranch. It had been carrying a shipment of exotic flora for a collector in the crater. The ship had been a write-off, and the flora, which had been in a state of suspended animation, had been declared a total loss. He had salvaged the wreckage for parts, but he had never bothered with the cargo. He had simply assumed it was ruined. But what if it wasn't? What if, against all odds, a few of the plants had survived? He went to the old storage dome, a dusty, forgotten corner of his ranch. The dome was filled with junk, the rusted hulls of old rovers, the shattered remains of a hydroponics system, and in the corner, a single, hermetically sealed cargo container, its designation plate faded and unreadable. He opened the container, and the air that rushed out smelled of a distant, forgotten world. Inside, nestled in a web of protective foam, were a few small bioluminescent pods. They were bioluminescent, their light a soft, ethereal blue that pulsed with a life of its own. He picked one up, his fingers trembling with a mixture of hope and disbelief. He didn't know if it was the right flora, but it was a start. He looked at Alexia, who had followed him into the dome. "Is this it?" he asked, his voice filled with a tremor of anticipation. She took the pod from him, her silver eyes wide. She ran a small, delicate hand over its surface, and a single, tearful gasp escaped her lips. It is one of our native flora. It is the one that produces the fluid. Elias, you have saved my life." She looked at the pod in his hand, a small glowing sphere of life, and thought, "It's a lot like a star, but smaller and a lot less likely to give me a third-degree burn." With the bioluminescent pod in hand, Elias and Alexia returned to the hydrobay. The room, which normally smelled of damp soil and the earthy tang of synth nutrients, was now filled with a faint, ethereal glow. The pod pulsed with a soft internal light, a living beacon in the sterile environment. Alexia carefully placed the pod in a clear, hermetically sealed container, the same kind of container she had used to hold her diagnostic tools. The pod floated in a suspension of distilled water, its light casting dancing, surreal shadows on the walls of the hydrobay. Elias, using a series of repurposed sensors and a jury-rigged micropump, began to extract the precious fluid from the pod. It was a painstaking process, a delicate operation that required a surgeon's touch. The fluid, a viscous, shimmering substance, was the lifeblood of the new relay. He watched as it slowly filled a small glass vial, each drop a testament to their improbable luck. As he worked, he felt a sense of focus and purpose he hadn't experienced in years. This was more than just a repair job. It was an act of creation, a collaboration between a human and an alien, each using their own unique skills to achieve a common goal. It was a bridge between two worlds, and he was the one building it. Alexia, meanwhile, was hunched over the main console, her silver eyes flitting over the schematics of the primary relay. She was mapping the genetic sequence, the intricate lattice of information that would allow them to grow a new one. "The process is complex," she said, her voice a low murmur. "The relay is not just a collection of wires and circuits. It is a biological entity, and it must be grown in a precise sequence. If we make a mistake, even a small one, it will not come to life." Elias listened, his hands steady as he worked on the pump. He didn't understand the science, but he understood the stakes. They were working on borrowed time.
And then, the quiet collaboration was shattered. The perimeter alarm, that same high-pitched wail that had brought Alexia to his gate, went off again. This time, the tone was different. It was a threat assessment, a high-priority alert. Elias's hands froze, and he looked at the main screen, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. The visual feed was a kaleidoscope of static, but the life sign scanner was clear. 3 separate life forms, humanoid, heavily armed, and moving fast. They were not human. Their energy signatures were the same as Alexia's, but corrupted, twisted. They were pursuers. Alexia's small frame stiffened, and her silver eyes went wide with a dawning horror. "They found me," she whispered, her voice a fragile, terrified thing. I do not understand. My distress beacon was so low power, they should not have been able to trace me." Elias ran his own diagnostics, his mind racing. The signal. It wasn't the distress beacon. It was his. The bypass he had created, the jury-rigged connection that had brought the ship to life, had created a feedback loop. It was a homing beacon. He had unwittingly led her pursuers directly to his doorstep. He felt a cold dread wash over him, a feeling that was 1,000 times worse than the fear of a predator. He had not just brought a problem to his home. He had brought a war. "Get inside the ship," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now, I'll buy you some time." He didn't wait for a response. He was already moving toward the armory, his hand on the hilt of his plasma rifle. Alexia, for her part, was not a helpless victim. She had been a diplomat, a representative, but she was also a survivor. She ran to the ship, the sleek, beautiful vessel that was her only hope. She sealed herself inside, and then, from within, she brought the ship's defensive systems online. A series of soft clicks and thumps echoed through the dome as small defensive turrets extended from the ship's hull, their muzzles aimed at the main entrance. Elias was at the main console, his fingers flying over the controls. He sealed every airlock, every dome, every entrance. He brought the ranch's automated defenses online, a series of defensive drones and sentry turrets he had built to protect his herd from predators. They were not designed for a conflict of this scale, but they were all he had. The screen showed the pursuers approaching, a trio of figures moving with a frightening speed and a single-minded purpose. They were not here to talk. They were here to kill. The first of them reached the outer perimeter, a tall, gaunt figure in a suit of what looked like polished obsidian. It carried a strange, elegant rifle, and it moved with a predatory grace that was utterly terrifying. Elias watched as the ranch's automated sentry turret turned to face it, a series of warning shots whistling past its head. The figure simply raised its rifle, and a single, silent beam of light shot out, reducing the turret to a pile of slag. The second figure, a short, bulky alien with a powerful build, moved to the main gate. It simply placed a small device on the gate's surface, and the reinforced metal melted away, as if it were no more than a sheet of ice. They were not just soldiers. They were specialists. They were here for a specific purpose. Elias took a deep breath, the cold fear replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. He was a man who had left the galaxy behind, but the galaxy had followed him. He wasn't a soldier, but he was a rancher. He had learned to protect what was his. He knew this land, this moon, better than anyone. It was his home, and he would not let them take it. He grabbed a satchel full of remote explosives, devices he had used to clear rock slides, and he began to lay a series of traps. He set them in the narrow corridors between the domes, in the low-lying craters, in the places where his enemies would be most vulnerable. He was a man who understood the terrain, and he was using it as his weapon. Alexia, meanwhile, was working frantically inside the ship. She had brought a few components with her from the crash site, salvaged from the wreckage before she had begun her journey. She now had the genetic sequence for the primary relay, and she had the bioluminescent fluid. She was working to combine them, to create the new relay, but the process was slow and meticulous. She needed a stable environment, a quiet place to work, and she had neither. The dome was filled with the sounds of a battle, the rhythmic thud of explosions, the hiss of plasma fire, the distant, muffled thuds of a war that had been brought to a quiet, desolate moan.
Elias, hunkered down in a narrow crevice, watched as the three figures moved toward the maintenance dome, their movements deliberate and precise. They were a team. They were professionals. They were not here to make a statement. They were here to finish a job. He waited for them to get close, his finger hovering over the detonator. He waited until they were all in the narrow canyon, their backs turned to the cliffs. And then he pressed the button. The explosions were not spectacular, just a series of muffled thuds, but they were effective. The ground trembled, and a shower of rock and dust rained down on the pursuers. Two of them were knocked off their feet, but the third, the tall, gaunt one, simply sidestepped the falling rock, its movements impossibly fast. It raised its elegant rifle, and a single, silent beam of light sliced through the air, hitting the cliff face behind Elias. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his arm as a piece of shrapnel from the disintegrating rock tore through his jacket. It was a warning shot. They knew where he was. Elias didn't hesitate. He scrambled out of the crevice, his arm throbbing with pain, and ran toward the main dome. He had to get back to Alexia. He had to protect the ship. As he ran, he heard a new sound, a deep, rhythmic thud that was not from a weapon. It was the sound of a living thing. The short, bulky alien was running toward him, its body moving with a surprising speed, its feet hitting the ground with a rhythmic, thunderous beat. It was a living battering ram, and it was closing in fast. Elias didn't have time to run. He turned, raised his plasma rifle, and fired. The beam of concentrated plasma hit the alien in the chest, and for a moment nothing happened. And then, the alien's skin, a thick, leathery hide, began to bubble and melt. The alien didn't fall, it simply grunted in pain, its eyes ablaze with fury, and it kept running. The plasma rifle was a powerful weapon, but it was not designed to kill, it was designed to incapacitate, to deter, and it was clearly not enough. Elias, with no other option, ran back to the maintenance dome. He sealed the door behind him just as the bulky alien slammed into it with a deafening thud. The door buckled, the reinforced metal groaning under the immense force. He looked at Alexia, who was hunched over a console, her small, graceful fingers working frantically. "How much longer?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. "I do not know," she replied, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "The genetic sequence is more complicated than I thought. I need a quiet environment, a place without chaos." The door buckled again, and Elias knew they were running out of time. He looked around the dome, his eyes scanning the space for a solution. There was nothing. They were trapped. And then he saw it. The massive geothermal power conduit that ran through the dome, providing heat and energy to his ranch. It was an old system, a series of thick, insulated pipes that were meant to withstand immense pressure. He looked at the bulky alien, at the door that was about to give way, and he knew what he had to do. It was a desperate plan, a last-ditch effort, but it was all he had. He ran to the conduit, his hands working frantically. He opened a small maintenance valve, and a jet of superheated steam hissed out, the air in the dome thickening with a moist, suffocating heat. He then, using a small cutting torch, began to sever the pipes, one by one. The plan was simple. He would create a chain reaction, a series of explosions that would sever the conduit and seal the dome, trapping the bulky alien inside. It was a risky plan. If he made a mistake, the entire dome could rupture, and they would both be incinerated. He heard the final, deafening crack of the door giving way, and the bulky alien stormed into the dome, its eyes blazing with a singular fury. It looked at him, at the small, fragile human who had dared to defy it, and it roared. Elias, with a steady hand, made the final cut. The pipe burst, and a geyser of superheated steam and plasma shot out, filling the dome with a blinding white light. The explosion was not spectacular, just a deep, rumbling thud, but it was enough. The pressure from the geothermal system was released, and the dome sealed shut, the reinforced metal groaning and creaking as it absorbed the immense pressure. The bulky alien was now trapped, a prisoner in a dome that was slowly filling with superheated steam. Elias, his ears ringing, his arm throbbing with pain, looked at Alexia. She was safe, sealed inside her ship, her hands working on the final, delicate stages of the relay's growth. He had bought them some time, but he knew it wasn't over. The other two pursuers were still out there, and they knew where he was. He looked at the dome, at the pulsating, glowing form of the ship, and he felt a new resolve. He had protected his home, and now he had to protect his friend. He was not a soldier, but he was a protector. He was a rancher, and his herd was a lot bigger than he had ever imagined. He looked at the hulking alien, its skin bubbling and melting from the plasma blast, and thought, "This is a lot like when I put the wrong fertilizer on the hydroponic tomatoes. A lot of grunting, a lot of unpleasant smells, and a lot of wasted effort."
The maintenance dome was a battlefield of broken metal and superheated steam. Elias, his arm throbbing with a dull, persistent pain, stood before the geothermal conduit, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the buckled door. He knew the pressure wouldn't hold forever. The bulky alien, the living battering ram, was a force of nature, and it was only a matter of time before it broke through. He had to act. He had to finish this. He looked at Alexia's ship, the luminescent whisper, its lights pulsating gently, a silent, fragile beacon of hope in the chaos. He had to buy her more time. He ran to the far side of the dome, toward a series of large, heavy-duty crates. They were filled with old, defunct machinery, salvaged parts from a life he had long since left behind. He began to drag them, one by one, a grinding metallic groan echoing through the dome with each movement. He was building a barricade, a last line of defense against the inevitable. It was a futile gesture, he knew. The alien had melted through a reinforced gate as if it were nothing. A pile of old machinery wouldn't stop it, but it would slow it down. It would buy Alexia the precious minutes she needed. As he worked, he heard a new sound, a high-pitched, resonant hum that was not from the ship. It was from the outside. The second pursuer, the tall, gaunt one with the elegant rifle, was here. The hum grew in pitch, and Elias knew what it was. It was a sonic cutter. They were not going to try to break in this time. They were going to cut a hole in the side of the dome, bypassing his barricades and his traps. He had miscalculated. He had assumed they would come through the door. He had focused on the obvious threat, and in doing so, he had overlooked the silent one. He looked at Alexia's ship. The lights were pulsating faster now, a frenetic, desperate beat. She was close. She was almost there. He had to be her shield. He had to be the wall that stood between her and her enemies. He grabbed his plasma rifle, his good hand gripping the cold metal, and he took a position behind a large metallic crate. The sound of the sonic cutter grew louder, a high-pitched whine that was like a nail on a chalkboard. The sound suddenly stopped, and a rectangular section of the dome's wall fell inward, a perfect, clean-cut rectangle of metal. The tall, gaunt alien stepped through the opening, its elegant rifle held low, its gaze sweeping the dome. It was a predator, and it was in his home. Elias didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The beam of plasma shot out, and for a moment it seemed as if it would hit its target. But the alien simply raised its hand, and a shimmering, almost invisible energy field shimmered into existence, deflecting the plasma blast. The energy field was not a shield. It was a countermeasure, a field that was specifically designed to deflect energy weapons. Elias's plasma rifle, his last hope, was useless. He had to think. He had to be faster, smarter. He had to use the environment to his advantage. He ran from behind the crate, his legs pumping, his mind racing. The alien raised its rifle, and a single silent beam of light shot out, slicing through the air where he had just been standing. He ran toward the geothermal conduit, the source of his earlier success. He had to use it again. He had to use the one thing they couldn't counter, the sheer, raw power of his ranch. The alien, its movements impossibly fast, followed him. It was a dance of death. A deadly game of cat and mouse. As he ran, his eyes scanned the dome, and he saw it. The massive hydraulic press he used to compress scrap metal. It was old, rusty, but it was powerful. He had used it 1,000 times, and he knew how to operate it with his eyes closed. He ran to the control panel, his hand fumbling with the controls. The alien, its elegant rifle raised, its silver eyes fixed on him with a chilling, predatory focus. He pressed the button, and the hydraulic press, a massive, solid slab of steel, began to move. It was slow, a grinding, ponderous movement that was agonizingly slow. He had to buy himself a few more seconds. He grabbed a handful of nuts and bolts from a nearby bin, and he threw them at the alien, a pathetic, last-ditch effort. The alien, its elegant rifle raised, its silver eyes fixed on him, simply ignored the nuts and bolts. It was a being of pure focus, of pure, singular purpose. It was not distracted by the mundane. It was a machine of death, and he was its target. And then he saw it. The geothermal steam, the cloud of superheated vapor that was still rising from the severed conduit. He had an idea. It was a crazy idea. It was an impossible idea, but it was all he had. He ran to the geothermal conduit, his hands working frantically. He opened a series of small maintenance valves, a series of jets of superheated steam hissing out, filling the air with a blinding white cloud.
The alien, its vision obscured, hesitated for a single, crucial moment.
That was all Elias needed. He ran to the control panel of the hydraulic press, his finger hovering over the final button. The press, a massive slab of steel, was now directly above the alien. The alien, its vision still obscured, was looking for him, his elegant rifle sweeping the room. Elias pressed the button. The hydraulic press, with a grinding, thunderous groan, began to descend. The alien, its vision still obscured, didn't see it. It was too focused on its target, on the human who had dared to defy it. And then, it was over. The hydraulic press, with a deafening thud, slammed into the ground, a single, silent beam of light shooting out from underneath it, a final, desperate act of defiance. The alien was gone, crushed into a pancake by the sheer, unyielding force of the machine. The elegant rifle, its purpose fulfilled, was now nothing more than a bent and broken piece of metal. Elias, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, leaned against the control panel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it. He had defeated the impossible. He had protected his home, and he had protected his friend. He looked at Alexia's ship, the luminescent whisper, and a new sound filled the dome. A low, rhythmic hum, a sound that was full of life and power, a sound that was a symphony of hope. The primary relay, the heart of the ship, was alive. It was pulsating with a powerful, steady rhythm, its light a brilliant, dazzling blue that filled the dome with a beautiful, ethereal glow. Alexia emerged from the ship, her silver eyes wide with awe. She looked at the wrecked dome, at the pile of shattered metal and superheated steam, and then she looked at him, at his exhausted, trembling form. She didn't say anything. She simply walked over to him, her small, graceful hand reaching for his. She touched his arm, her fingers brushing against the wound, and a soft, gentle light emanated from her hand, a healing light that soothed the pain and sealed the wound. He looked at her, and he knew. This was not just a collaboration. It was a bond. It was a friendship that had been forged in the crucible of battle, in a moment of shared purpose and a common goal. The third and final pursuer, a figure of silent, ominous grace, had been watching the entire time. It had seen its companions fall. It had seen the human, the rancher, the man who had defeated the impossible. It now stood at the opening in the dome, its gaze sweeping the scene, a silent, implacable fury in its eyes. It did not carry a weapon. It was the weapon. It was a being of pure psionic energy, a telepathic assassin. It looked at Alexia, at the small, fragile figure who was its primary target, and it raised its hand. A wave of raw psychic energy, a wave of pure concentrated hatred shot out, a silent, deadly force that was aimed at her heart. Elias, without thinking, threw himself in front of her. The wave of psychic energy hit him, and he felt a searing, agonizing pain, a pain that was 1,000 times worse than any physical wound. It was a pain that was not in his body, but in his mind, a pain that was trying to tear his mind apart. He grunted, his body tense, his eyes squeezed shut against the psychic assault. But he did not fall. He had spent his life in solitude, his mind a fortress of quiet, unwavering resolve. He was a man who had faced his own demons, his own loneliness, and he had come out the other side. He was a man who had built his own world, his own life, and he would not let it be torn apart by an alien mind. He pushed back. He pushed back with the sheer, unyielding force of his will. He pushed back with the memory of the long, silent days and the quiet, star-dusted nights. He pushed back with the thought of his ranch, his herd, his life. He pushed back with the thought of Alexia, the small, fragile being who had come to his door and who had trusted him with her life. He pushed back with the full, unbridled force of his humanity, and for a moment, the two forces, the alien telepath and the human rancher, were locked in a silent, cosmic battle of wills. The alien, a being that had never encountered a mind so resilient, so focused, faltered. Its telepathic assault, a force that had brought down entire civilizations, was useless against a mind that was a fortress of quiet, rural stubbornness. Elias, his mind a quiet hurricane of determination, pushed back one last time. He poured every ounce of his will into the psychic assault, and the alien, its mind reeling from the unexpected resistance, staggered back. It had underestimated him. It had assumed he was just a simple rancher. It had assumed he was weak. It had assumed wrong. The alien looked at him, its expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. It had met its match. It had met a man who was not a soldier, who was not a warrior, but a rancher. A man who was a quiet, unyielding force of nature. The alien turned, a flicker of something that looked like respect in its eyes, and it disappeared back through the hole it had created, a ghost in the wind. Elias, his body trembling with exhaustion, fell to his knees. The battle was over. The long, silent days were gone, replaced with a new reality, a new purpose, and a new friend.
Alexia knelt beside him, her small hand on his arm, her silver eyes filled with a quiet, profound gratitude. You saved me," she whispered, her voice a fragile, emotional whisper. He looked at her, and he smiled. "I'm just a rancher," he said, his voice a tired, happy rasp. "I protect my herd." She returned his smile, a small, beautiful expression that was 1,000 times more beautiful than any of the stars that shone in the night sky. She stood, and she offered him her hand. He took it, and together they stood up. The silence of the moon was gone, replaced by the hum of a ship that was now ready to fly, a ship that was now ready to go home.
They spent the rest of the day and night preparing the ship for launch. Alexia, with Elias's help, loaded the new primary relay into the ship's core. The relay, a pulsating, glowing sphere of life, fit into its place with a soft, organic click. The ship's systems, once a broken, chaotic mess, were now a symphony of synchronized, powerful energy. The ship was not just fixed, it was reborn. The next morning, at dawn, they stood on the landing pad, the luminescent whisper looming behind them, a beautiful, powerful vessel that was a testament to their collaboration. Alexia turned to him, her silver eyes filled with a quiet, profound gratitude. "Elias," she began, her voice a soft, melodic whisper, I do not know how I can ever repay you. You gave me back my life. You gave me back my home. And you gave me back my purpose." He smiled, his gaze fixed on the rising sun, the distant, shimmering ball of light that was the earth. "You don't have to repay me," he said, his voice a low, gentle rasp. "We were just two people helping each other out. That's what we do. That's what we are." She reached up, her small, graceful hand cupping his face. "You are more than a rancher, Elias. You are a mender. You mend things that are broken, and in doing so, you have mended me. You have given me hope." She stepped back, and then she was gone, her small form disappearing into the ship's entry hatch. The ship's engines hummed to life, a deep, powerful thrum that vibrated through the ground. The ship lifted off the landing pad, its gravitatic stabilizers working with a silent, perfect grace. It rose into the sky, a beautiful luminescent beacon against the black canvas of space. It was a symbol of hope. It was a symbol of a promise. It was a symbol of a friendship that was 1,000 light years long. And then it was gone, a small, shimmering dot in the blackness, on its way home. Elias stood there, alone, his gaze fixed on the sky. He was a rancher again, but he was no longer alone. He had a new purpose, he had a new friend, and he had a new sense of hope. He turned, and he began to walk back toward his ranch, a new, quiet purpose in his heart. The long, silent days were gone, and a new, quiet, hopeful future had begun. He looked at the alien's broken rifle, its elegant design a testament to a forgotten purpose, and thought, it's a lot like a politician's promise. Looks good from a distance, but up close, it's just a useless piece of junk. I hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell to be the first to know when I upload a new story. So until we meet again, have a fantastic time and be kind to each other.